I will introduce our keynote presenters, and I will save the introduction for the discussants at the end after the main presentation. So we have two co-presenters today, Tessa Palafu and, Danielle Carreira Ching. I'll start off with Tessa. She is an implementation research assistant at the Baker Center for Children and Families Implementation Research Division. Tessa grew up in Hawaii and graduated from Hawaii Pacific University in May 2023 with a BA in psychology and political science. Her research interests include understanding historical trauma in Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander populations and promoting the well-being of underserved populations, particularly NHPI through implementation science. So welcome aboard, and thank you very much, Tessa. Next, we have Danielle Carreira Ching. She is a fifth-year doctoral candidate pursuing her PsyD in clinical psychology at HPU. Danielle has worked with Hawaii's youth for the past 18 years in various capacities. They received a BA in psychology from UH West Oahu and went on to complete postgraduate coursework and research in the psychology of social relations at Goldsmiths University of London. She is most recently a research assistant with the Baker Center for Children and Families and the Hawaii State Child and Adolescent Mental Health Division. Welcome, Danielle, as well. All right. So without further ado, I'm probably missing something, but in case not, Danny and Tessa, take it away.
Thank you so much for having us. Okay. Okay. So we're here to talk about a topic that both of us are really passionate about and have done quite a few projects on, and some of those major projects today. So I will go right into it. And we're just really grateful to be here and share this space with you all. Oh. Okay. So on the agenda, we'll do a brief introduction, very brief, since Dr. Nakamura did such a great introduction already. We'll talk about historical trauma, origins, definitions, impacts, where that originates, and then also like within the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander context. We'll talk about current research, mostly our own, but our research does gather research, so part of that is a scoping review, and then future needs that we found just in the past few years that we've been doing this research. And then we'll talk about culturally grounded treatment recommendations from that research that we have explored in the past few years. So this is our Baker Center team, and we're a bit of a mixed bunch because some of us are partially CAM-HD and partially Baker Center, but just a team of amazing folks that I'm very privileged to have gotten to meet, some local folks and then some folks who join us from the East Coast. And we are currently growing as well to accommodate our most recent project and grant work that Tessa will talk about towards the end. We do want to acknowledge the funding that has funded these projects. So we have Hawaii Pacific University Undergraduate Infrastructure Student Research Center, also known as HUI SRC, which has funded quite a bit of Tessa's work, and then the Data to Wisdom grant out of the Hawaii State Department of Health, Child and Adolescent Mental Health Division, particularly the Trauma Informed Care Task Force, which the project that I'll talk about in bulk serves to support, at least in part. And then, of course, the Baker Center has supported us, and yeah. Oh, I also meant to mention our fearless leader, Dr. Kelsey Okamura, who has really supported and guided us through all of this work. Okay. So we have some learning goals, and we have little clip arts from, I can't remember where they're from, but little clip arts that go along with each goal. Each slide has the goal and the clip art, so if you want to follow along with each of those. So learning goal 1 is describe historical trauma within the NHPI context. Goal 2 is to identify current and potential research in this area. Goal 3 is to identify culturally grounded treatment recommendations. So we do have a Mentimeter poll. If folks who are able can join us at menti.com, you can use this code. And I will actually switch out. There is a QR code, but it's being a little wonky today. So I'm going to switch screens. Oh, yeah. Is it not? Okay. Here's our first poll. If folks can join. Oh, that's a great one. Mm, it's like a little real-time art project. A sad one. Yeah, some really great ones. Oh, imperialism. Yeah. So it looks like folks are pretty well versed or have a good sense of historical trauma. Grief is looking like a really big one, which I think it feels really heavy on my heart, in particular around this topic. Yeah, pain and loss of culture, absolutely. So I think that will continue to update as folks contribute to it. Oh, that might have been it. Oh, yeah. Thank you all so much for participating in that. Oh, Kanaka. Oh, Wounded Warrior. I like that one. Okay, I'm gonna stop. I could keep looking at this, but I'm gonna stop sharing it. Okay. So that really kind of sets the context for what we're here to talk about. And I feel like it maybe sort of breaks the ice a little because it is a very it can be a very uncomfortable topic depending on, the group that you're in, or I mean, it is an uncomfortable topic, I think. So, but we are very excited to be here to talk about it because that's the only way. Okay. So that brings us to our first learning goal, describe historical trauma within the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander context. And I'm actually going to turn it over to my co-presenter, Tessa, who's going to share with us a bit about that.
Thanks, Danny. Awesome. It was, oh, you're good. Thanks so much for sharing screen. Yeah, thanks everyone for filling out that Mentimeter. It's really great to get a feel of, what's the familiarity with historical trauma. And so we wanted to start by sort of giving a general overview of historical trauma in the literature and how that has developed over time. So, generally, historical trauma is defined as the complex collective trauma experienced over time and across generations by individuals who share a common social identity. Historical trauma as a concept began to take shape from clinical observations that were made with Holocaust survivors, as well as descendants of Holocaust survivors. So there were a lot of observations of heightened rates of depression, guilt, aggression, and impaired interpersonal relationships. And these observations sparked a really important discussion and examination of how the experience of a massive group trauma, which in this case was the Holocaust, have impacts not just on those who have firsthand experience of the traumatic event, but on subsequent generations. So around the 1980s is where we see the beginnings of the application of historical trauma to American Indian and Alaska Native populations. And a really great pioneer of this work is Dr. Braveheart, who has done a lot of work with Lakota people on the continent and looking at how historically traumatic events such as the Wounded Knee Massacre and the relocation of children to boarding schools are contributing factors to the health disparities that are noted within Lakota communities, such as increased suicide rates, substance use, and heart disease rates. Particularly, Dr. Braveheart noted how the outlawing of traditional spiritual practices in the Lakota communities disrupted the typical mourning process, which she coined historical unresolved grief. And I know I saw that pop up in the Mentimeter. A lot of people talked about, the word grief. And so from the study of the impacts of this unresolved grief and historical trauma came the development of what is now known as the historical trauma response. So this is the set of a set of characteristics or constellation of responses that have been noted in communities who have been impacted by historical trauma. And this includes things such as increased rates of depression, self-destructive behavior, and suicidal thoughts and gestures. And we'll talk more deeply about historical trauma response in the next slide. So there's been a lot of push recently and over the years to develop scales to quantitatively measure historical trauma so that we can better understand the impact of it on communities. So over time, different measures have been developed specifically for American Indian and Alaska Native communities. For example, the historical loss scale identifies how often an individual thinks about certain losses, such as the loss of cultural practices. And recently, there have been a lot of movement to adapt these scales for other Indigenous populations. So this past year, there was a paper published that examined the psychometric properties of an adapted historical loss scale to Native Hawaiian communities. And I would encourage folks to read that. But there have been a lot of promising advancements in this area, but there's still so much work to be done. So if we go to the next slide, talking and delving a bit more deeper into the historical trauma response, like we mentioned. Again, this is a set of characteristics that have been identified in communities that have experienced a collective trauma. So some of the identified symptoms we have are increased rates of depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts and gestures, anger and low self-esteem, self-destructive behaviors, difficulty in recognizing and expressing emotion, as well as self-medication. So a lot of the historical trauma response that we see here is also reflected in the health data that we have for American Indian and Alaska Native communities. So we see that AIAN have the highest rates of suicide across all racial and ethnic groups in the US, as well as the second highest rate of illicit drug use. Interestingly, some scholars have noted how a cultural resilience, which is similar to what we think of as a post-traumatic growth, may also be an impact of historical trauma, where culture and connection to culture becomes this cohesive protective factor against the impacts of colonization and can lead to things that we now see like a cultural renaissance. And of course, throughout this presentation, it's one of our learning goals, and we'll talk more extensively about how culture plays a role in well-being for Indigenous populations. For the next slide. So now we're going to talk more specifically about Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander historical trauma. So I'm sure we're all very familiar with the health data on NHPI, and it's reflected in a lot of the work that we do. So within Hawaii, we see that NHPI high school students have the second and third highest attempted suicide rates. NHPI teens have the first and third highest rates of illicit drug use. NHPI have among the highest rates of heart disease in the state, and Pacific Islanders have the highest rates of diabetes within Hawaii. So again, I'm sure this is very familiar to a lot of folks here and is reflected in our work. So it's important that we see how the health data for NHPI here is also what we see as identified characteristics of historical trauma response, right? Just like we talked about in the previous slide, all of this that we see here, increased rates of suicide, increased rates of diabetes, are identified impacts of historical trauma in the literature. So this sets up a really strong case for us to look at the impact of historical trauma within Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities. So now we're going to talk a bit more specifically about NHPI historical trauma. So I want to first start by saying that although we have a limited understanding of historical trauma for NHPI in the literature, this is not an entirely new concept for those in the community who are living with the ongoing impacts of colonization. So I want to start by reading this quote, which comes from Dr. Hanane K. Trask's work in her book, From a Native Daughter. And it reads, for the people who suffer the yoke of imperialism, it is a total system of foreign power in which another culture, people, and way of life penetrate, transform, and come to define the colonized society. The results are always destructive, no matter the praises sung by the colonizer. And we've been talking about these results for the past few slides, right? The impact of historically traumatic events, which Danny will talk about more in a second, is impossible to ignore, right? We see that a lot of the health disparities within AIAN communities, where a lot of the groundwork of historical trauma has been laid, is also reflected in Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities. So there has been a lot of work recently to understand historical trauma. And actually, there was a recent study that was published that looked at Native Hawaiian youth experience of historical trauma. And this was conducted by Dr. Riley, and actually Anna here, who is one of the discussants, is a co-author on this paper. And they talked with Native Hawaiian youth, and in the paper, they describe how Native Hawaiian youth discuss and express sadness and anger in relation to historical events, as well as pride of their Native Hawaiian heritage. But what was really great to see and what I loved is that the youth also discussed ways to address historical trauma within their communities, which shows that they're actively thinking about this and brainstorming ways to promote well-being. So just as we noted before, there are similarities in the experience and overall experience of colonization across Indigenous groups, but there are also distinct historical experiences within NHPI communities that may impact historical trauma. So a study that was done by Dr. Alvarez and colleagues noted a few of these distinctions in their work with Native Hawaiian communities, and they noted things such as the militarization of land and the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy. So now I'm going to pass it back over to Danny, who will talk a bit more about these specific events across Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities.
Thanks, Tessa. Okay. So with all of this, with the word history, I think we think a lot about specific events. So there are a lot of specific events that we can draw on, that scholars draw on, that knowledge holders draw on, particularly for Native Hawaiians. And I have the Kamaha syndrome in quotations here because it is still sort of a debated terminology for historical trauma. In Native Hawaiians, and I certainly am not the one to determine whether or not it is the appropriate term, but it is a term that some scholars are using. So we have specific events, things like the arrival of Captain Cook, Mahele, bayonet constitution, the legal overthrow, as Tessa mentioned, annexation, and statehood. But there are also all these other losses that maybe don't have specific events, or they're not as heavily documented or known within the general community, but things like outlawing of religion and language, destruction and desecration of sacred sites, and land, which we still see now, depopulation by disease or diaspora, dispossession of land, which we still see now, and economic deprivation, all of which are still kind of co-occurring and sort of operate systemically. So we see that for Native Hawaiian historical trauma. We also see it for Pacific Islander historical trauma. Again, a lot less in the literature and in the general knowledge that's out there for people to explore, but just a few across some Pacific Islander groups. So World War II military engagement and occupation by Japan and the US, extensive nuclear testing in Micronesia, Marshall Islands, forced cultural assimilation, genocide, and occupation in Samoa, suppression of language and religion, and genocide of Chamorro, the indigenous peoples of Guam, and occupation in Guam, forced cultural assimilation, genocide of Maori in Aotearoa or New Zealand, but lots of limited sort of research on individual Pacific Islander groups, probably quite a bit more in like Maori groups, but less and less, particularly Micronesian groups, Samoan and Chamorro groups. So a few of those, and then again, just knowing that those come with these impacts that maybe we don't see, and that are why we are here today and why we need researchers doing this really important research. That brings us to our learning goal 2, identify current and potential research in this area. So we'll talk specifically about our projects in the humblest way possible, because none of our work is possible without drawing on all of the wonderful work that Native Hawaiian researchers, Pacific Islander researchers, Native American researchers are doing in this area. So I think Tessa will go first. I will hand it over to her.
Thank you. So I get the privilege now to talk a bit about this project that we've worked on for the past 2 years now, I want to say. And the title of this project is Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander Identity and Housing Status, the Impact on Historical Trauma and Perceived Stress. I want to first start by thanking my wonderful co-authors who've been such an amazing support on this project and this work. So Danny, who's my co-presenter, and Drs. Scott Okamoto, Veronica Costa, and Kelsey Okamura. And again, thank you to the funders of this project, HUISRC. All right, so next slide, yeah. So last week we submitted this paper with revisions to the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health. Today, we will be presenting a subset of the results, but I am more than happy to discuss with anyone who is interested, and hopefully the manuscript will be available for everyone to read soon. So for some background information, this was my first independent research project as an undergraduate student, and it stemmed from a lot of the work that I used to do in the homeless services field. And the fact that Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders, as I'm sure we all know, are overrepresented in Hawaii's houseless population. So the guiding research question for this project was, how does Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander identity and houselessness affect the perceived stress and historical trauma experienced by transition-aged youth? So 2 quick things I want to note before we move on. One is that for this study, transition-aged youth represents those between the ages of 18 and 24 years old. And this is actually the age range that the state uses to define transition-aged youth in homeless services. Secondly, I use the term houseless instead of homeless throughout this presentation. And this comes from my previous experience where people experiencing houselessness tended to prefer the term houseless over homeless. So I will be using that term. All right, so hypothesis. Our first one. We had 2 main hypotheses for this project, one of them being that Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders would report increased experience of historical trauma compared to non-Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders. For the purposes of this project, anyone who reported that they were Fijian, Guamanian or Chamorro, Marshallese, Micronesian, Native Hawaiian, Palauan, Samoan, Tahitian, or Tongan were considered in NHPI. Our second hypothesis was that participants experiencing houselessness would report increased experience of historical trauma compared to housed participants. And for the purposes of this project, a participant was considered houseless if they reported living in an emergency shelter, transitional shelter, or in an outdoor public area. So to measure historical trauma, we use the historical traumatic event scale and the historical loss scale. Both versions of these scales, the scales that we use, were adapted to be used in a study with Native Hawaiian college students. So more specifically about these 2 scales, the historical traumatic event scale asks participants to indicate whether themselves, their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, or great-great-grandparents had experienced a list of events such as the desecration of traditional lands or were forced not to speak their native language or practice cultural expression. And to calculate the scores for this scale, every positive answer where participants indicated that this event was experienced was coded as a 1, and every negative answer where participants indicated that this event was not experienced was calculated as a 0. Then the responses across all 8 items were summed together. The historical loss scale, like we mentioned previously, asked participants to indicate how often they thought about specific losses, such as the loss of culture or the loss of land. And participants were able to indicate whether they thought about these losses never, yearly, or at special occasions, monthly, weekly, daily, or several times a day. And then the scores were calculated by recoding these responses on a scale of 0 for never and 5 for several times a day, and then summing across all 8 items. Okay, next slide, thank you. We partnered with local organizations that serve the houseless population as well as university departments to recruit participants. And in total, we had 51 participants. who had an average age of about 21 years old, were mostly female, Asian, were living in permanent housing. So the housing status, the highlighted results in the housing status section indicate participants who were considered houseless, just like we mentioned before, those who were living in an emergency shelter, transitional shelter, and outdoor public area. All right, so what did we find? First, related to our first hypothesis, we found that there was no significant difference between Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders and non-Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders on the historical loss and historical traumatic event scale. So if you look at the graph on the left, it shows the average NHPI and non-NHPI scores on the historical loss scale. And we see here that there isn't really that much of a difference visually and within the scores, with NHPI average score being 13.7 and non-NHPI's average score being 13.9. If you look at the graph on the right, this shows the average scores for these two groups on the historical traumatic event scale. And we see that although there is more of a noticeable difference visually on the graph as well as in the scores, that is still not significant. So we see that Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders had an average score of 4.9, while non-NHPI had an average score of 3.5. And we'll talk more about why we think we're seeing these findings in the discussion section. But moving on to our second finding related to our second hypothesis, we found that there was no significant difference between houseless and house participants on the historical loss scale. So if you look at the graph on the left, it displays the average score for the two groups once again, and we see that houseless participants had an average score of 11.4, and house participants had an average score of 15.3, but still that was not a significant difference. However, we did find a significant difference between houseless and house participant scores on the historical traumatic event scale. And so we see that house participants scored an average of 5.6 and houseless participants had an average score of 1.9. So this is the opposite of what we originally hypothesized. So we'll talk a bit more about why we think we're seeing this finding in the next slide. All right, so let's talk about why we think we're seeing this. So for the first finding that there was no significant difference between NHPI and non-NHPI scores on the historical trauma scales, one reason we could be seeing this result is due to an unexamined variable that we did not measure in this study. So culture, both the connection to and identification with one's culture, has been proposed to be a protective factor. So in this case, we did not include any measures of cultural connection. However, culture may serve as a protective factor for Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities, right? Indigenous communities have long led the discourse on the importance of culture in promoting well-being. And actually, one study that interviewed American Indian and Alaska Native elders found that they shared how their connection to their culture, which included not just the values of the culture, but also their identity, the connection and practices, as well as their connection to the community, served as a source of resilience when confronted with oppressive systems, racist behaviors, and the impacts of historical trauma. A study that was published this past year actually found that Native Hawaiians who reported more positive feelings regarding their Native Hawaiian identity also reported higher life satisfaction. And similarly, there was a study that looked at Pacific Islander well-being in Hawaii, and they found that biculturalism was associated with higher self-esteem, which had impacts for healthy eating and overall well-being. So altogether, this suggests that the connection to culture can disrupt the expected impact of historical trauma on communities by serving as a source of resilience, just like we talked about previously. So one explanation for the finding that house participants scored higher than houseless participants on the historical traumatic event scale is the differential access to knowledge. So just like we talked about, the historical traumatic event scale focuses on the experience of the past 5 generations, which is information that's may not be easily accessible or well known. I know I'm not sure I know very much about my great-great-grandparents, right? So for Indigenous populations, knowledge is often passed throughout generations by family members. However, those experiencing houselessness may also experience family separation, which could disrupt the transfer of knowledge across generations. So For example, a study with Indigenous youth experiencing houselessness in Canada found that participants described experiencing family separation from a young age due to early death, being forcibly relocated to boarding schools, as well as relocated through the child welfare system. So altogether, I think this warrants a closer examination on the impact of family separation on knowledge transfer, as well as the experience of historical trauma. So the study has a variety of limitations that should be considered when interpreting and discussing these results. One being the small sample size, right? We had 51 participants, which makes it difficult to detect any statistical significance, even if one was to exist. And another limitation is that the study was not operated through a community-based participatory research lens. And previous research has indicated that distrust toward researchers within NHPI and other Indigenous communities due to historical injustices serve as a barrier to recruitment. And so community-based participatory research has been identified as a potential method that can be used to rebuild trust and ensure mutually beneficial research products. So although this study did not use CBPR, future studies should look to use community-based participatory research to build trust and create beneficial outcomes both for communities and researchers by co-creating research questions, method, and recruitment materials. Last limitation I'll talk about real quick is that this project was strictly quantitative due to resource restraints, but adding a qualitative piece would have been helpful to provide context to these results and get a deeper understanding of the experience of participants. All right, quickly, some future directions. Where do we go from here? As mentioned, future studies should really seek to examine the role of protective factors and community strengths, the role that plays in the experience and impact of historical trauma. Additionally, just like Danny and I have mentioned throughout this presentation, a closer look at Pacific Islander historical trauma experience is warranted, as well as the adaptation and development of measures for historical trauma across these communities. So I'm now going to pass it over to Danny to discuss some of the work that she's done.
Thank you, Tessa. So I'll talk about the scoping review that we spent a little over 2 years doing. Tessa was my co-reviewer, and this is actually my dissertation research, which I just successfully defended a couple of weeks ago. So really excited to be here and talk about it, but also just love this work. So I do want to thank Tessa was my co-reviewer. When I share the prism diagram, you'll just see the extent of what that entailed. Okay. So this is our prism diagram used to disseminate information on systematic and scoping reviews. This one specifically for scoping reviews. So pretty much all the information on the left side. So starting from the second box on the left, we screened title and abstract items, a little over 11,000. So 2 individual folks looking at each of those, one of them myself and then another co-reviewer, some folks on our team, but primarily Tessa. We screened 686 full text items as well. So 2 folks looking at that again. And then we ended up with 91 articles, dissertations, or master's theses in our extraction phase, which the 2 of us worked on as well. Okay. So the aims of this work were to provide a summary of the extant literature on historical trauma for Native Hawaiians specifically, to provide a common and objective definition of historical trauma for Native Hawaiians, and then to provide recommendations from the literature to improve Native Hawaiian health and well-being. So I'll go through each of the aims, starting with the first one. So a summary of the extant literature. So again, 91 articles, dissertations, and master's theses completed between May 1988 and November 2022. Primary setting was the United States, the continent United States. Very few publications actually coming out of Hawaii, 6 out of 91 versus 56 from the continent. 2/3 were peer-reviewed journal articles, and then 1/3 came from mostly doctoral dissertations, and then a few master's theses. And there were representations for lots of folks here today, actually. But overall, all mentioned historical trauma in the context of some health or well-being disparity for Native Hawaiians. Oh, and there are, quite a few gaps here. So around the 1990s, the mid 1990s. So some interesting things that we might speculate about those gaps and the different types of changes that we see over time. But still good to see this continually rising line overall. So talk about the second aim, a common and objective definition of historical trauma for Native Hawaiians. There were 26 articles of the 91 that provided a definition of historical trauma, so not just mentioning historical context to the work that they did, but actually providing a definition to that. And there were 6 components that we extracted qualitatively to compose these definitions and that we use to compose the comprehensive definition. So those 6 components were oppression from a dominant group, collective sadness and suffering, cumulative effects, processes by which oppression is enacted, direct events that represent processes, and then long-lasting impacts to the oppressed group. I will read this definition out loud and try not to become emotional. Okay, so the Kaumaha syndrome, or historical trauma among Native Hawaiians, can be comprehensively defined as a soul wounding or generational eha, pain, hurting, aching, rooted in collective sadness and moral outrage, carried within the ancestral memory from the cumulative emotional, biological, sociological, and psychological wounding that extends across the lifespan and generations, resulting from a series of massive group trauma experiences, primarily due to colonization, war, genocide, and cultural, social, and political subjugation through deprivation of equal access to social, economic, and political resources. This trauma is multifaceted. It includes 1, spiritual trauma through the outlawing of Native Hawaiian religion and the destruction and desecration of sacred sites. 2, physical trauma through the depopulation caused by disease and diaspora. 3, economic trauma through the dispossession of land and economic deprivation. 4, socio-political trauma through the loss of self-governance with the illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy and subsequent political domination of the established Hawaiian kingdom by the United States. And 5, psychological trauma through the loss of cultural identity and the ongoing experiences of racism, oppression, and marginalization, leading to complex, interconnected health and well-being disparities, which may be mitigated by cultural resiliency and other group protective factors over time. So this is a cumulative definition or a comprehensive definition pulled from components of the 26 definitions that were found in the scoping review. This is a bit of a map of how they kind of align. So the 6 components here in 6 different colors. So we have oppression by a dominant group, the United States, although there are, other things that occurred as well with the United Kingdom, things like that. Collective sadness and suffering. So at the top here, cumulative effects, processes by which oppression is enacted. So spiritual trauma, physical trauma, economic trauma, socio-political trauma, and psychological trauma. Direct events. So without adding in all of those dates and specific things, because it would just take it to quite a very lengthy definition. And then long-lasting impacts with also the inclusion of a potential protective sort of factor that we see similar to a post-traumatic growth type thing, potentially, because that is represented in folks' descriptions across the 26 articles. I will go through the third aim now. So recommendations to improve Native Hawaiian health and well-being, all of which are pulled from the articles in the scoping review. And which brings us to learning goal 3, to identify culturally grounded treatment recommendations. So qualitatively analyzed the articles that did provide recommendations specifically for historical trauma. There are 5 themes that emerged. These themes are really just facets of society. So community, education, government, healthcare, and research, as well as 4 nodes, which are a bit more bespoke And I won't go through the definitions of these just for the sake of time, but again, happy to talk about those and hopefully submit this somewhere. But there are 4 nodes: advocacy and systemic change, culturally relevant adaptations, reconnections to culture, and reconnections to resources. This is a map of the themes and nodes across each other. So I think like really relevant that we see all of the nodes represented across the themes of healthcare and education. But for something, say, like research, we see culturally relevant adaptations, advocacy, and systemic change. So I think like very relevant, lots of things we could speculate about just looking at this map, but for the sake of time, I won't do that either. But happy to discuss when we open it up a bit later. So I'll go through each of the nodes now and just give a few of the recommendations. And then I'll also do some youth-specific ones, considering our audience today. So first node, advocacy and systemic change. A few recommendations from the literature. So acknowledgement of the existence of historical trauma and recognition of its importance, particularly in education and healthcare. Addressing of impacts at the governmental level, so things like policies. Increased attention to historical context in research. And I think that might be a really big one for folks here today, and just the topic of our conversation is having that historical context. For node 2, culturally relevant adaptations. So integration of Native Hawaiian spirituality and historical trauma into treatment planning. As a trainee, this like highlights in my mind to have that as an ongoing component of that work and our considerations of folks without being too prescriptive as well. Inclusion of cultural conceptions related to cultural norms. So things that are cultural understandings for seeing or hearing things or experiencing things versus things like hallucinations. And I do think that we, at least as a trainee, are attending to this, or at least we say that we are, and we have it as a consideration, even in the DSM. But the extent to which we as individuals implement that in our practices or in our work, it differs greatly. Increased attention to cultural safety. So a lot of recommendations around cultural safety. And, you know, it really made me think about what does that even mean? And what does it mean to whom? And how are we using that word? But certainly an important recommendation to expand on, I think. Node 3, reconnection to culture. So reconnection to land, or Aina, via land-based activities and practices. Return to land-based understandings of stewardship and responsibility for current and future generations. And then reclamation of land from US government. So within each of the nodes, we see some more perhaps easy to implement things, and then we see some more ambitious things as well, which I think is great. That means we are kind of looking forward. We have multiple steps in front of us that we can take. So last node, reconnection to resources, implementation of cultural healing models. And I think with each of these, a disclaimer about how we enact these things. We can't just take recommendations and be like, well, I'm implementing a cultural healing model in my practice or things like that. So a lot of discussions around that and how we put these recommendations into practice, but we have a start here, right? Scholarship funding and programming for Native Hawaiian students, particularly college students, and I'll talk about that when I talk about youth. Return and or restoration of land lost and or destroyed. So again, some more ambitious ones, but certainly relevant and important to discuss. Some specific school-aged ones. So recommendations from the literature: integrated educational programs at K through 12 schools to provide healing opportunities and increase cross-cultural understanding and respect. One of the things that I really appreciate about the youth-specific ones are that they often really highlight inclusion of non-Hawaiians as well and cross-cultural understandings. And I think that is maybe where a lot of healing can come, especially for young folks. Another recommendation: educators trained in Native Hawaiian history and comfortable addressing difficult topics such as historical trauma in the classroom. Again, just highlighting that this is a difficult topic to discuss and that, you know, we are really coming together just by being here talking about it together. So Development of curriculum that incorporates Hawaiian cultural practices and knowledge to build pride for all youth, including non-Hawaiians. So just by being in this place, just makes this a relevant thing to address. A few more school-age youth ones. Education on historical trauma, amplifying youth voices, education on the reality that this is something in the now or current, a modern issue, concern, and battle. Cultural programming, especially Aina-based learning. Consideration of the modern context of reconnection and the reality of modern society. So what does this look like for youth? What does this look like for younger generations or older generations? And what are the practicality concerns with trying to reconnect to culture in today's modern society? There were quite a lot of recommendations for college students and campuses. So a few here. Acknowledgement of historical trauma and its impacts by colleges and universities. So I think inclusions of actual activism, work versus, I think anyone can say, oh, we're an institution of Native Hawaiian learning, or, we can put all of these things in our mission statements, but are we creating that environment? Inclusion of Indigenous critical education in our curricula. Efforts to decolonize and transform fields and contexts. Psychology is specifically noted in there because it is often so Western based in our teaching, in our training. And then just this sort of academic dominant cultural context that is also very Western. A few more for college students and campuses. So this is kind of doing that work of going beyond the mission statement. Efforts to build a sense of community congruent in the context of Native Hawaiian values to create safe spaces for Native Hawaiians. Counselor training in Indigenous history, epistemology, cosmology, and Indigenous ways of knowing or healing practices. And then decolonization of college curriculum, acceptance and inclusion of Indigenous research protocols and processes. And I do think like there are quite a lot of efforts across all of these, right, that are kind of occurring here and there, and just kind of highlights this work that we all kind of share just by being in this place together. Some future research directions. So research to refine and validate measures of historical trauma for Native Hawaiians specifically, and Tessa touched on that a bit just this year, 2024. But also like the potential to build our own measures or things like that. Inclusion of standard measures of historical trauma in research. So we looked through quite a lot of articles that didn't have a measure included, but had a historical context. So I think dwindling down from like the 91 articles, only 2 had a standard measure in which they actually measured historical trauma. Development and implementation of culturally grounded approaches. So I think that one's very popular right now. Lots of folks wanting to do those kinds of things. And then research on individual Pacific Islander groups, because we are just not seeing enough of that. Tess and I are particularly interested in like Samoan thing, like Micronesian. But even as we went through the scoping review, just very few things that we found there for those groups represented. And I will turn it over to Tessa to talk about our next big thing.
Thanks, Danny. And thanks for, going over all those recommendations. That was super helpful to hear. So we wanted to give an example of some culturally grounded work that is currently being done in the community that our team has been working on. That's been really exciting for us. And for me, I'm super excited. So one substance use prevention intervention that specifically targets Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander youth is called Ho'onopono. And so this intervention was developed through partnership with Hawaii Island schools and 5 National Institute of Drug Abuse funded projects over the course of 2 decades to develop culturally grounded videos that depict realistic scenarios of drug and risky situations. So this curriculum, it's modular and delivered by teachers in middle school health education classes. So the intervention has demonstrated sustainment of youth resistance strategies in a 6-month randomized pilot study. Additionally, youth participating in the follow-up efficacy trial showed significantly slower rates of growth in cigarette and e-cigarette use. So as we just mentioned, Ho'onopono was developed and implemented on Hawaii Island, However, a few years ago now, members of the Windward District here on Oahu reached out to us about the potential of implementing this curriculum in their school district. So ever since then, our team, led by Kelsey Okamura again, has been doing and looking for ways to do this work. So on the next slide, this past year, Kelsey, our mentor, received a National Institute of Drug Abuse Racial Equity Award to implement Ho'onopono in the Windward School District. And so it's so exciting because the heart of this project is that this is community and student-led, where students will be the one to brainstorm ways to implement this curriculum within their schools and really take it on as their project and something that they can do. And so the implementation of this curriculum will be done through 5 phases, with the community at the core of each phase. So this is a figure showing and highlighting each of these phases. So the 5 phases are innovation tournaments, building the big idea, implementation with coaching, community sharing of implementation, and then finally building implementation champions. So in phase 1, innovation tournaments will be held to identify grassroots implementation strategies of delivering Ho'onopono. So students will brainstorm ideas on how to best implement the curriculum within their schools, and they'll have the opportunity to showcase their idea in a school assembly. Then a community advisory board that will be comprised of Department of Education staff, students, and community-based organizations will review these ideas and rate them to determine the top 2 or 3 ideas. And our goal with rating and identifying the top ideas, not to look for the most efficient or cost-effective one, but to really find the one with the highest rating that indicates a higher degree of community buy-in. So for example, a student may have a passion for hula and propose integrating in traditional Hawaiian dance into drug prevention curriculum. So then the student, with the support from their peers and teachers, can lead a school-wide initiative that celebrates Hawaiian culture while also promoting healthy lifestyles, with them being the youth expert. Then in the 6-week-long phase 2, building the big idea, the student whose idea was chosen and their implementation team will be given weekly support to build out their strategies and plan using cutting-edge implementation methods. So we'll collect needs data to understand the context, such as barriers and facilitators to implementation. Project management will be provided and include supports with timeline development, budgeting, and creating the necessary organizational infrastructure. In the 3rd phase, implementation with coaching, we'll begin the rollout of the curriculum. So we'll use ecological momentary assessment, which is where participants report their thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and environments in real time. And this will be the foundation for real-time adaptations and support for implementation teams. So this will allow for educators and community members to receive timely feedback on the effectiveness of their interventions. And through this, the real-time data collection, we'll be able to identify emerging trends, address implementation barriers, and refine our strategies in response to the evolving needs of the community. So this iterative approach ensures that our efforts remain responsive, relevant, and impactful. In the community sharing phase, implementation teams will present their findings to the school on implementation success and lessons learned. And this really gives the students an opportunity to highlight their leadership and communication skills and to prepare the schools for sustainment of the curriculum. In the final phase, building implementation champions, the implementation team will be paid during the summer to plan for the next round of innovation tournaments that will take place in the next school. So they will lead the advisory board using the lessons that they've learned from their project to adjust the delivery, engagement, and execution of the next 4 phases. So new student and community organizations will participate in the preparation phase to co-develop the approach. All right, so what are the expected outcomes for this project? First, Ho'onopono will be spread through novel implementation strategies tailored to the unique context of rural Hawaii schools. A menu of community-grounded implementation strategies will be generated and shared with the community to solve future implementation challenges. And then finally, youth and community members will lead implementation efforts, creating a new cycle of research within the Windward District. And I think that's the most exciting part to me. And I'm excited to see this take shape over the next few years. All right. So we have a final poll before we open it up for discussants. I'm excited to hear everyone's thoughts, but just a quick reflection on what are some ways we can incorporate some of the concepts from today into our own work. I know maybe putting everyone on the spot, I'll give you a few minutes to think about that. But I'm excited to hear what everyone's thinking. We'll pull up the Mentimeter. I believe it's the same one that we used for the first poll. All right. Yeah. So you can take maybe a few seconds and start brainstorming and writing down how you're thinking this can be incorporated to your work that you do on a daily basis. Listen to understand. Absolutely. Intentionally seek our learning opportunities on NHPI Health. Yeah, definitely. I know there's so much to be learned. Like every day, I feel like I'm learning something new, which is great. Consider biases and positionality when working with others. Absolutely. I noticed a lot of the literature that we've looked at include positionality statements in their manuscript when they're publishing on this kind of work. More INA-based and cultural frameworks in my position at Kula. Yeah, definitely. QR code. Awesome. Actively ask about historical and generational trauma. Seek information about everyday experiences mirroring historical and present trauma. Yeah. Trauma-informed practices in the school setting. This is great. Consider historical trauma in case formulation. That sounds interesting. I'm not a psychology trainee yet, so I can't speak to that a lot, but maybe Danny has some ideas of that too. But yeah, better empathetic listening. Absolutely. Yeah, thinking through our own biases and tendencies. Yeah, I know when I first started doing this work and looking into this kind of research, there was so much that I realized I had to like kind of question my own biases and things that I just sort of my mindset, which comes as we learn and we grow, and we'll make mistakes, of course, but as long as we're looking to actually work through those and learn. Awesome. Okay, thank you for everyone for your responses. You can keep putting them on. I'm excited to read through those some more, but just wanted to end with a quick thank you again for letting us and allowing us to come here and present and listening. And I'm excited to hear from our discussants and everyone else any questions or thoughts on the presentation. And here's our team and partners that we've worked with over the years. Yeah, thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you so much, Danny and Tessa. Excellent presentation. A lot of hearts and claps and all these things going on in the emojis. So right about now, during stellar in all regards, content process, sharing, interaction, and you ended on time on what you said you would end, leaving time for our discussants, which is maybe the most gigantic, difficult thing sometimes. So now I would like to introduce our two discussants. And typically, kind of what we'll do, if it's okay, we'll save some time and space for our two discussants to kind of take turns giving their initial thoughts and reactions. Also to kind of, if we start getting questions from the audience, they can start fielding those questions. But we just would really be honored for any thoughts, reflections, next steps from our two excellent discussants. So if I could please introduce them, starting first with Dr. Aukahi Austin Seabury. She is a licensed clinical psychologist and the executive director of Iola Lahui. She received her PhD in clinical psychology from the Clinical Studies program at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. She completed a pre-doctoral internship at Tripler Army Medical Center with an emphasis in community and health psychology, and a postdoc fellowship at the University of Hawaii at Manoa Department of Psychology in Child and Adolescent Evidence-Based Practice. She is a member of Na Limahana o Lonopuha Native Hawaiian Health Consortium and sits on the State of Hawaii Department of Labor and Industrial Relations Health Workforce Advisory Board. She provides training to behavioral health providers on the use of culturally minded evidence-based practices. So let's welcome our first discussant before I introduce our second one. Second, but last but not least, we want to introduce Ana Malia or Ana Sue, and she is a community psychology doctoral student at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Her family is from I'll do my best on pronunciation. I'm sorry. From the villages of Utule, Fagatogo, and Fitiuta, American Samoa. Ana and her two younger sisters were born in Hawaii and raised in Ka'aava on Oahu and Kea'au on Hawaii Island. Ana's research interests include culturally responsive policies and programs for Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders in health and education. She is also interested in community-based participatory research and indigenous research methods. As a graduate research assistant, she has worked on projects focused on Native Hawaiian resilience and historical trauma, as well as alternative incarceration models in Hawaii. Ana was selected as a public health law fellow with the CDC and Change Lab Solutions in 2023, where she worked with the Great Plains Tribal Leaders Health Board in South Dakota on issues related to tribal health data access policies. She holds an MA in psychology from the University of Hawaii at Manoa and a BS in psychology from Chaminade in Honolulu. She currently lives on Hawaii Island with her husband and their three children, her mother and younger sister. So let's welcome Ana as well. Thank you, Ana. And then maybe we don't have anything scripted, so I don't know any order or anything. So Aukahi and Ana, I'll turn it to the two of you right now.
Aloha mai kako. I believe I am the elder of the pair, so I'll go first. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here, to be part of this conversation. My first thing is just ho'omaikai nui ya olua to you, Tessa and Danielle. Please, mahalo nui for this work and for your persistence and grace and love in what you do and how you emulate the excellence of the Pacific in what we do and how we move. That is one of our values. And the way that you carefully put words together and showed how you can have na'au and ike and heart all in one was wonderful. And in iko'u mana'o, the healing and restorative practice can begin with the researcher. That Tessa, when you were sharing about the initial findings from the 50-ish people that were willing to fill out a survey that are unsheltered and they're still willing to talk to you, I was like, that is the biggest thing. And that when you felt like you're like, I have to explain the data when there weren't any findings, that's historical trauma telling you that you have to defend yourself and whether your work was good or whether, no, but I promise for real, we really do have problems in the way that you were like, this finding has maybe it's a sign of how strong we are. It's like, it's okay. But the need to defend yourself, you are correctly sensing as something that academia and often our society and community expect of Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, that they're like, see what you're grumbling about with a finding like that, right? That could make the newspaper and be this thing that we then all have to manage. And so as you experience going through this, just continue to do the zone defense of teaming up with each other to interpret and ask the hard questions. You haven't even begun to ask all the questions you have. I can see that. And I wanted to encourage you to continue your hypotheses about why. I mean, we can start with sample size. You put that one at the bottom, but I was like, easiest answer. There were some trends in a nice direction. Nah, or not. Or we can say, you know what, something else is going on here. They're all unsheltered. They all have unstable housing. Maybe they all got bigger problems. Maybe we're experiencing what we could consider a ceiling effect here, possibly. I mean, I haven't seen the data, I don't know, but I have 100 ideas. But I think I just wanted to speak to the idea that you two, as researchers, experiencing and healing from cultural and historical trauma as you study us unapologetically and put it out loud is quite beautiful, and that doesn't compromise your research integrity. It certainly hasn't compromised the quality of your thinking and the rigor with which you pursue work. And so my first thing is just mahalo nui, and continue, please. And I got your back, and I have like 100 ideas, but there's too many minutes. But I got you, both of you, individually feedback about these projects you're doing. I'd be happy to share more. And intrigued by the construct that moving to becoming a diaspora of people across the Pai'aina, or not just Hawaii Pai'aina, but across the whole Honua, that as evidence of cultural and historical trauma is quite intriguing as a way of thinking, when I know that many diaspora Hawaiians both experience that and then also don't. So I don't know, that's an interesting topic related to the definition. And then over here going, and then so many Pacific Island peoples are living in the diaspora, including Hawaii, as another of the sort of intriguing parts, just sort of at the definition level. I'm intrigued by much of that. And anyway, I'm going to toss the ball now to Ana Malia because I could talk all day. But I thought maybe that was my like Pakipika throwing to Oceania, the kind. Oh, wait, one more thing before I go. Juan Rapadas, is that you coming in from down south? I hope that's you, as one of the champions of Pacific peoples for the last many decades. Brilliant psychologist. Anyway, okay, sorry. Go ahead, Ana Malia. Hi, that's you. Hi, Juan. Okay. Sorry. Guam
Yeah.
represent. Okay, I'll be quiet.
Thank you, Dr. Seabury. And thank you, Tessa and Danny, for your wonderful presentation. Just echoing what Dr. Seabury had to share. Thank you for all your work. And I think you both did a wonderful job covering such a complex but important concept that we should all learn more about, especially being here in Hawaii. Native Hawaiian or not, we should all be more informed about historical trauma and its impacts today. I think something that stuck out to me throughout your presentation was just the intergenerational and community component of historical trauma, and how often sometimes folks can hear the word trauma and it's like, oh, it's just impacting one person, or it's like just an intergenerational, so maybe just one family, but really historical trauma is so much bigger than that. And there was a timeline mentioned, so there's these ongoing effects and events that happen that take a lot of education and goes right back to schooling, and how can we improve our schooling and our healthcare and all of these things that should be informed by through a trauma lens, informed care. So yeah, I think just if the problem is at this level, then the healing intervention should be at this level too, and thinking about policy and how that can impact our care that we provide and the education that we provide for our young people. So I guess I'll just leave it at that. Wonderful job. And yeah, where can we go from here?
Yeah, so thank you, everybody. So from here, it's pretty flexible for all of the presenters and the panelists, ranging from sometimes we have questions from the chat, of which Andrea helps us monitor. Because it's a webinar format, folks can't just, for better or worse, folks can't just unmute and just start shouting things. So Andrea is usually kind of the one to help us kind of read through the question. Sometimes we might take a comment or question from CAMD leadership. We would have no EBS roundtable if it wasn't for folks like Dr. Hernandez Armstrong here. Sometimes with experts in the room like Anna and Akahi, Tessa and Danny would be like, oh my gosh, the two experts here, I want to ask them these questions. Or Akahi had mentioned a multitude of ideas. So we can kind of take it however folks want. I don't perceive, maybe I missed it, too many questions popping up other than people wanting more and wanting to see the recording. So maybe we can just go for a couple of minutes. I don't know if Tessa and Danny have initial reactions or comments to what Anna or Akahi said. If not, Akahi can take it
Really
away.
quickly.
We can go anywhere.
Sorry, but
Leslie's
really
in the
quickly,
chat.
there is sorry, sorry, not okay. Yeah, there's someone who raised their hand. I think it's Miss Monique. So I'm not sure we can allow individuals to speak, I think. So would we like to open up to that? And then there's also one question in the Q&A by Dr. Slavin. So
That sounds great. Let's go with the hand raiser and then
let's
the
start with Miss Monique first, and then
yeah,
yeah.
and then
Okay, so
Leslie in the
I'm gonna try to do that right now. All right, here we go. All right, there you go, Monique. I think you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Aloha.
all right,
Oh,
we can hear.
mine was more of a statement, and I just wanted to give some halanui to the presenters. And the work here is so important because I've felt that Kaumaha syndrome. I'm Native Hawaiian Kanako Iwi from Nanakuli and raised by two activist parents. I was present at the bombing of Makua, present at many indigenous formats. However, this Kaumaha syndrome is so prevalent amongst our kupuna and keiki alike, and we can see it in the names that our kupuna have versus the names that we give our children. And I think I discussed this on many occasions when we can see our grandparents named after biblical um, heroes or ideologies, and then now our children being allowed to carry their Kanaka names is so beautiful. And that informed care that I think at in elementary school they can provide to address our keiki by their Kanaka name, by their Hawaiian heritage is so important. So I just wanted to make a statement. I just wanted to mahalo nui all of you for all of your Maikai work, and thank you so much for shedding light on our people and our keiki, and especially the kupuna of Hawaii. Mahalo. I don't know how to unmute now. Okay. Oh, mute now.
Once you're in for life, Monique. You have to talk the whole time. I'm sorry, people that know me, I'm very good at terrible jokes. But thank you very much. I'll leave it to the panelists to expound upon that or expand.
Yes.
Oh, no, I was just gonna say thank you, Monique. Yeah, I think I'm sure it resonates with a lot of us here, and especially just reflecting on my own personal experience, like growing up, I think I've had these feelings, but there's no way to like really express it, or there wasn't like a term to like put it to. And I think just like you mentioned, we see it in our elders. I see it in my dad. I saw it in my grandma and my grandpa, but there wasn't really a way to name it. And so I think a lot of this work has been transformative for me personally, getting to understand that more and recognizing it in my community. So yeah, I just wanted to say I definitely resonates, what you're sharing.
Mahalo. I was actually thinking about that idea about like in the idea of like trauma informed care and training, which is so the language of today and the intention and interest of the community, right? That we want to do that. And then this idea of sort of like cultural and historical trauma, that was Monique was a really good example of encouraging teachers to use the person's given name and not going, can I call you Kahi? Which is fairly typical in school experiences of youth at this point. So anyway, I just wanted to ditto you there and say that's quite an important conversation to have in training. I was reading Leslie Slavin's question, and I thought it was actually a really good one, because as I understand the conversation around cultural and historical trauma and how it's measured, there is both the sort of self-report aspect, which can be confounded just exactly by what you're talking about the intersection of, do they have enough information to know that's what's happening, with being bothered by it, right? So how often do you think about it, and did this happen to anyone in your generations? You have to have knowledge sufficient to be able to, I think that's a quite thing. So a self-report. And then the other part being, can we assess for an entire group that group has cultural and historical trauma based on those sort of larger predictive factors to go, do they have this? Did they as a people have this and this and this? And so it's just an interesting measurement question. I'm sure you guys tackled it a little bit in deciding, not just because self-report is easier. I am positive that's not what it is. So can you share more? And maybe your two kinds of research point a little bit to the answer, which is we both need review of large groups and literatures and writing and individual conversations. But just a guess, just tossing you her question, going, yeah, good question, I guess.
I think that's a part of why so much of the work that we see is qualitative in nature, because researchers just want to go out and hear, what do people think? What do youth think? What do youth in the juvenile justice system think? Or how do they understand things? And I think just working with them, like as a practicum student, if you listen to them, it's there. The pain is there. There is an understanding there. The language is a little different, right? So, and I think that's our responsibility as academics or as clinicians or researchers or providers to bridge that gap, not to teach them the language, but to learn the language from them and turn that into our understanding of what this modern day historical trauma looks like. Yeah. But I think we can also look at so many things, even despite like two Native Hawaiian Renaissance, like there are still so many young folks or folks in general with generations of disconnection from language, generations of disconnection from culture, and how you reconnect to those things. So I think just, do you have to go to a college class to be able to learn your native language in your native land? That's sort of telling of something there. But as far as measuring it, I think that is why most of the work is qualitative. So I think a lot of the recommendations around adding a measure are adding it to work. So including it as well and seeing how that goes and examining, is it the measure? Are we measuring it appropriately? Or do we need to develop something to measure it? Which I would speculate that we probably do. So we probably need a specific measure. But that 2024 paper, I think it's Antonio et al., is a really good start, I think, to examining the measures that we do have and how those are fit into the work that we want to do. We have more questions now.
We do have more questions, yeah.
If I can just go off of what Danny shared, and as we're doing our talk stories, so I know in the beginning I was introduced, I'm a research assistant with Dr. Linda Riley, and her work with Native Hawaiian youth and the experiences with historical trauma, and talking story with youth at the at Kawailoa or Hawaii Youth Correctional Facility. It is there, like you said, Danny, and I think sometimes it can be just a matter of connecting the dots between present day trauma and trauma of their parents or previous generations. And again, like you said, it's our job to connect those dots. And then looking across the lifespan, which is some of the work that we're doing now, as folks get older and maybe have interactions with more with schooling or what have you, they have those words to piece together what might have been missing in younger days. So I think that is kind of what we're working on now with developing a measure from the qualitative work that we're doing, talking story with folks, with youth all the way up to kupuna, and everyone in between. And what are these constructs of Native Hawaiian historical trauma specifically, and how can we develop a measure that is relevant to this community?
Thank you, everyone. So this is great. I feel like the party is just getting started in some ways. We got three questions coming in like the last two minutes. So maybe if the panelists and the presenters and our discussants could take a look, maybe going into Diane's one first, and we'll kind of see what we have time for. If we could save 2 minutes at the end, so it's like 4:28 for some housekeeping about how to get the CEUs and stuff, that would be great. So anybody can take it away with Diane's question, or that'd be great.
I think for Diane's question, just for me as a psychology trainee or a clinical trainee, I really appreciated Kalam Kukui by Resentes, just as a sort of cursory kind of decolonizing of the way that I think going into psychology work. But any of, Haunani Trast's work, yeah. I don't know I'm sure other folks have better suggestions than I do.
No, I was just gonna piggyback off of what Danny shared. And we included a quote from the book, but from a native daughter was huge in my um development in this area and kind of really sparked a lot of my interest here. So I always recommend people to read that. Yeah.
I can add, and then there were none, as a sort of foundational video documentary sharing. That's one really good one at an intro level, just to kind of give the basics quickly. Just me. Are you cool, Anamalia? I was going to jump to the next question already. Is that okay? Do you have more?
Oh, yeah. Oh, no, that's okay. I'm not a counseling student, so I'll let you folks take that one.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to hit it on this Ho'oponopono one, and just to say thank you so much to the person who shared the question. The best resource, if I have to only take 1 minute to answer this, is to go to Papa Ololokahi. They have resources online, but they have been doing probably the most recent work in gathering Ho'oponopono practitioners across the state, across the world, I suppose, to have shared understandings about movement and advocacy and how Ho'oponopono is interacting with health services and systems at this point. But sort of the idea, if you're asking the basic question, Ho'oponopono as a traditional healing practice is done by a person who was trained by a kumu or loea in that practice. So it's not something that even I, who am a Native Hawaiian woman who practices in a culturally minded way all the time, do, because I'm not a trained Ho'oponopono practitioner. Where does it fit? It fits where it makes sense. And most of the time, a conversation with the Ho'oponopono practitioner about whether it's an appropriate construct or concept is really helpful. So I would say to lean into them, because they do have a list and a directory of folks that are available, and can connect you to resource on the island that Ohana lives on, because that really matters. You don't ask a Ho'oponopono practitioner from Waianae to come to Waimanalo, because they have to make some phone calls to feel appropriate to be there. So just kind of that as my quick answer, unless somebody else has a different way to guide someone who's looking for more support. I appreciate the question, because if you don't know, how do you know, right? And if you don't know the guy, you can't call him. So Papa Ololokahi can help you get started. Mahalo.
All right, then I think we can move on to the very last question, or I think it may be more of like a comment on Dr. Leslie's comment, but if there's anything else to add. But if not, I think, Brad, we can go into our last housekeeping things, if panelists and stuff don't have other stuff to add.
Yeah, maybe I'll do the kind of closing housekeeping, and then maybe we can turn it to each of the presenters just for a final closing one-liner or two-liner or whatever. So I wish I had something profound to say. This is so amazing. This is going so well, and I'm like talking about housekeeping and CEU, so I apologize for the junkness of what I'm about to say. It's so superficial and kind of junky, but as a friendly reminder about the CEUs, whichever email you use to register for today's roundtable, please be on the lookout for a feedback survey that we'll be sending to that specific email address. Right, if you signed up to receive social work CEUs awarded both based on your time in the session. We're looking for at least 90% of participation in today's session, as well as completing the forthcoming survey. If you didn't sign up for social work CEUs, we'd still be very grateful for you filling out the survey, as that helps give us ideas about how today went, and we give the discussants as well as the presenters summary of the results. In addition, the Hawaii Psychological Association, with the support of the Hawaii Behavioral Health Connection, a program of HPA, is co-sponsoring this roundtable and offering CEUs for its HPA members. So special gratitude and appreciation to HPA and the Hawaii Behavioral Health Connection as well. So sorry for that stuffy housekeeping stuff about CEUs, and that maybe we can turn it over to the presenters and discussants for a final kind of any kind of closing thoughts. Thank you.
I have no other profound things to say either. But just thank you again. I'm always like open to hearing from everyone. Like if you have thoughts on the projects we talked about, I will put my email in the chat. I would love to discuss more. But yeah, thank you all for allowing me to present today. I'll pass it over if people have better things or more profound things to say.
Danny, maybe we can go with you, and then Anna, and then Akahi can close us out if that's okay.
Profound things to say.
Or
I
just
do
closing
think-
thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah. I can say that being involved in any of this has just been very healing for me on both sides of my family. So the Hawaiian side and the Native American side. And I think also this sort of combined mixture with a lot of British and English ethnicity as well. So it can be very healing to do this work, but it can be very heavy. And I'm just really grateful that everywhere we go to talk about this, we find a new sort of community of folks who are embracing. And that just makes me happy for future generations that, you know, hopefully we're creating a more paved path as we go. So.
Thank you, Danny. Anna?
Yeah, just wanted to say thank you, mahalo whakatai, for having me today. It was great to learn from you all. And it really gives me hope for the future directions of research and just work overall. I'm hoping to see more work about historical trauma in our policy and yeah, to heal our community. And I will pass it to Dr. Seabury now.
Aloha kako, that's the manui here, is just that convening and holding this conversation, speaking our language where and whenever we can and want to, even if it's just to the sky and the ground. All of these things move us forward. And you, Wahine, who have put this work out, and all of the people, that many hands that clearly are the ko'olau, the many supports along the way, have taken us a step into a really important place. And just keep stepping. All of you, please keep stepping in, asking the hard questions. Mahalo nui.
Thank you, everyone. So that brings us to a close right on the dot. Thank you, everybody. Have a nice day. Hope you'll consider attending future roundtables. Panelists, if you have a second to hang on, that would be great. And people, yeah, so feel free to start exiting the room. Thank you very much.